Welcome back to the Rooted in Resilience podcast. Today it is just me, Ashley. Sarah is dealing with a few things around the farm. It's a crazy week here at the farm. We're transitioning to a completely new website, starting a new LLC, and we're switching from UPS to FedEx. So Sarah's dealing with quite a few matters. So I'm going to take the podcast recording today, and I am so excited about today's guest because I feel like he really understands the research side of things and PhD and graduate school. And so we resonate on a lot of those topics. And we are going to dive into not only what you eat matters, but what your food eats matters as well. And so we are going to dive into the topics of PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, and look at kind of the historical trend of how our ancestors ate or did not eat these things and how it kind of rose to be a quote health food today. So I am so excited to present today's guest, Dr. Knobbe. You were actually the first person that I listened to in a YouTube, I think it was at an Ancestral Health Foundation symposium. You were presenting at some sort of conference, and this was the first YouTube video that I ever listened to about 5 years ago, introducing myself to the topic of omega-6s, linoleic acid, and PUFAs. And so it's really cool to talk with you today. And I would say I would consider you a friend. And so it's really cool to come full circle where learning about a certain topic and then continuing to learn and reaching out to and connecting with this individual. So Chris, what should I call you? Chris?
Chris.
Okay, Chris, it is an honor to have you here on the podcast. And if you can give our audience a little bit of background information in terms of your education and what you study and kind of what you do today in regards to research.
Sure, Ashley. Well, first of all, thanks. It's great to be on your podcast. We've been friends for, a couple of years or so, at least I think. But anyway, it's great to be on your podcast, and it's an honor and a pleasure too. And so my background. Well, I'm a physician first. I am trained as an ophthalmologist. I spent an entire career in ophthalmology. That's basically eye surgery and disease. My brief story is that I have struggled with my own health issues, which are primarily arthritis. And that really got me into nutrition back in 2011. So about 12 years ago. And I basically began to investigate as much as I could about nutrition for a couple of years. I came across Weston Price's research, and I began to understand that it's processed foods driving all this chronic disease. I hypothesized that those same things might be driving age-related macular degeneration, AMD, which is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 worldwide. And I was so convinced that hypothesis held water, Ashley, that I left practice in February of 2015, to pursue that. And because I felt it was so incredibly important there was already by 2006, something like 14 million people with severe vision loss and or blindness this is bilateral, both eyes, by 2006, and the numbers growing and growing. 200 million people with macular degeneration worldwide, and I just felt it was so incredibly important to pursue this. So that's what I did, and we looked at data in 25 nations, processed foods using proxy markers of sugar and vegetable oils versus age-related macular degeneration prevalence, and the data in every single nation supported that hypothesis. So we published that in 2017. I published a book, started a nonprofit foundation. And then eventually, as you kind of know, this may be where you caught up with me, was I just continued to see that there's so much evidence and that the highly polyunsaturated vegetable oils, what many people would call seed oils, are the major drivers of all this chronic disease, that I didn't feel like that was being covered very well. So that's when I went public with that, which the first time I went public with that on a broad scale, like, regarding all these chronic diseases was in 2019 at the Ancestral Health Symposium. And I've kind of been focused on that ever since. Recently published another book, this one called The Ancestral Diet Revolution. And I continue to do research, and I do some public speaking, not a great deal. It's because it's difficult, it takes up a lot of time, and my focus, as we just talked about offline, is that I'm working in the published science arena to try to change allopathic medicine. But that's basically it.
So I think there's two important things that we need to cover before we even dive into PUFAs. The first is that Chris is a trained medical doctor. And if you listen to his introduction, he said that he had to go back and relearn nutrition principles. So, Chris, can you talk about how little nutrition information you were actually taught in medical school, and I guess a few classes maybe, and kind of what the main narrative was in those courses?
Oh, yes. Well, it's simple. We were taught nothing.
Well,
Really, literally, to my knowledge, unless I'm wrong, Ashley, it was absolutely nothing.
I love Western
Honestly, I
medicine.
don't think I'm exaggerating when I say I don't think we had 5 minutes worth of nutrition in medical school. I don't think that's much of an exaggeration. It's not much different in medical schools today. And as I've said many times, what we were taught was probably mostly wrong. There probably would have been just a little trifling of information that saturated fat is bad. Cholesterol might be bad. Beyond that, I don't remember anything about nutrition. There wasn't ever a discussion about food or ancestral health or westernized diets, processed foods. Absolutely none of that. It's not, and this is par for the course. I mean, I graduated from the University of Colorado School of Medicine back in 1990, so it was 33 years ago. Things haven't really changed. And I wondered when I finally came across the first book I read in this arena was Lauren Cordain's book, The Paleo Answer, and I read that in 2011. I was on the beach in Cancun in Mexico, and for a week, and I read this book, and I was shocked, stunned. I was just blown away that all of this, chronic disease essentially is, I at least knew that it was driven by processed food. And that was the first time I ever understood that. And so I felt in a way betrayed. I felt, and I also felt literally just dumb that I still am just boggled that for 21 years after I graduated from medical school, that I never really questioned root cause of all this disease. I never was thinking. We were not taught that way, but I think that's the way 99.7 or 8% of physicians are. That's the way we're trained if we're trained in allopathic medical schools, and we're taught that there's all these just myriad different diseases, and there's something like 11,000 medicines to treat all those, or there's procedures, right? And there's diagnostic procedures and then surgical procedures. And I'm obviously trained as a surgeon, so a whole lot of what we did in ophthalmology is surgery based, and so actual surgery and laser treatment, but never once until 2007 or 11, right in there somewhere, I came across a couple of things where I began to think, oh my gosh, we've been duped, and I didn't understand any of this.
Yeah, but it's not your fault. Biopharma spends so much money continuing Western medicine education this way. And don't get me wrong, Western medicine plays a very important role, especially in surgeries and emergency situations. But the fact that there is absolutely zero discussion on preventative care and root cause healing, and it's all about, oh, it's your genetics. Don't worry about it. Just take this pill and you'll be okay. and it's more of sick care, not preventative care. It's showing, right? Like the results of this are showing with the drastically high rates of chronic disease development now in children. And so it's just, I want you guys to understand how important Chris's role is, because with him leaving his practice, he can now focus more on like a wider scale. And as he mentioned in the introduction, he's working in the research. So he is publishing papers with the hopes of these papers influencing Western medicine, influencing the next round of medical doctors. Like this is a very important role, but I want you guys to understand how hard it is to be in academia and to publish papers. So I went through graduate school, and one of the hardest parts was getting the paper submitted and accepted. So there's one part where you write the paper and you submit it to the journal, right? Like, okay, you think you're done. No, then there are reviewers who are not at your institution. These reviewers are kind of randomly selected by the paper that you submitted to. You don't have to know them. They just have to be somewhat tangential to your field, and then they review your paper and tell the journal this should or shouldn't be published, and if it is published, it needs to have these revisions. So understand that Chris is submitting papers to these journals. The journals are then sending it out to other doctors who are influenced by Western medicine education. They're critiquing his paper, and his paper is basically the opposite of what they're taught. So his role, like this is a very hard thing to navigate. And Chris, like if there is there anything that other people can do to help like improve the publication of these things, or is just like sharing your papers, is that advantageous?
Well, yeah, yes to both questions. I think that first of all, you have to actually educate these reviewers in general, because they don't really know anything about ancestral health or ancestral nutrition versus westernized nutrition or processed foods, essentially. Because again, that's not part of allopathic medicine's training. And so I think the enormous majority of PhDs and MDs and MD PhDs that are the ones that are reviewing papers that sit on the panels of these journals, they are not in this space, and they don't know what we've already talked about in these first few minutes. They wouldn't have any concept of that in general. And so you have to get past that, and you have to try to educate the reviewer in order for them to potentially give the thumbs up for publication of the paper. So it's a very difficult and enormous hurdle to get past.
And I think it's also important to remember that when we are looking at other papers and we are understanding the literature as a whole, and always remember that point that we have to think back to what the education system is saying, right? And so it's tough. All right, ready to dive into PUFAs and
Yes,
kind of your discoveries and what you've published? So I
absolutely.
think before we dive into it, let's just give a brief reminder to everyone kind of what PUFAs are. I'll start, and then you add on to what you think is important for our discussion. So
Okay.
there are different types of fat. And so some examples of fat that you consume in your diet are going to be egg yolks, and milk contains some fat, and then fatty cuts of steak, butter, tallow, suet, nuts, seeds, vegetable oils. So all of these contain fats, and then all of these fat sources contain a particular amount of fatty acids. So there's no one fat that is purely saturated. There's no one fat that's purely polyunsaturated. All of these different fats in our diet are a combination of these different types of fatty acids. So we've got polyunsaturated fatty acids, we've got monounsaturated fatty acids, and we've got saturated fatty acids. And so all of these are referring to the number of carbon-carbon double bonds along the fatty acid chain. And each of those double bonds represents kind of an unstable point along those fatty acid chains that are susceptible to oxidation under heat, under light. And what is the inside of our bodies? We are 98.6 degree Fahrenheit mammals. And so all of these types of fats are important when we consider what we consume, and the percentage of each, I think, is the most important part. And that's really what Chris's work dives into is the amount that we currently consume of polyunsaturated versus monounsaturated versus saturated relative to what our ancestors were consuming back in the days. So, Chris, is there any other background information that you want to talk about the different types of fats, maybe omega-3 and omega-6?
Yeah, not a lot. You summarized it perfectly. Yeah, so I'll just move us toward where we're headed, which is that we're going to try to make the point that saturated fats and monounsaturated fats really are very, very healthy, and the polyunsaturated fats are also very, very healthy, but the amounts that we consume are critical to our health. And the seed oils, the polyunsaturated vegetable oils, they are loaded with omega-6 fat or fatty acids. And that primary one is omega-6 linoleic acid. That's the 18-carbon omega-6 fat. There are people now, since we've kind of been vilifying seed oils now for a few years, there are people saying that omega-6 linoleic acid is toxic, it's a toxin, and so forth, and nothing could be further from the truth. It is no more toxic to us in the right amounts than is iron or copper or vitamin A. We require all of these things, but we require all of them in the right dose. Everything has its sweet spot, including oxygen, water, nitrogen, everything you can possibly think of has a proper dose, right, Ashley?
The dose makes the poison.
The dose makes the poison, right? And so with these, historically, the world had almost no vegetable oils up through the American Civil War, ending in 1865. And this is when seed oils entered the food supply right after that. And these seed oils are rich in omega-6 fatty acids. And over the next 155 years, after the American Civil War, these gradually took over a great portion of the fat that we consume, and in doing so, we increased our omega-6 linoleic acid consumption on the order of 12-fold. So we went from 1.1% omega-6 linoleic acid in our food in the United States in 1865, when we didn't have any seed oils, all the way to 11.8% of our diet as omega-6 linoleic acid in 2008. So we have basically it's 11-fold increase in omega-6 LA linoleic acid, whether you look at it by mass or by percentage. And all of the evidence to me suggests that we should be under 2% omega-6 linoleic acid. I've looked at a number of the hunter-gatherer populations who are free of chronic diseases, and all of them are pretty much under 2% omega-6 linoleic acid. And why are they? Because they don't have vegetable oils. Where would they get them? The vegetable oils are a product of industry. So they came out of the Industrial Revolution, and they've really taken over our food supply. And I'll give one quick fact here, Ashley, is that in 1900, in the United States, 99% of our added fat came from animal fat, lard, butter, or beef tallow. But by 2005, 86% of our added fat came from vegetable oils. And with this, so you see this incredible increase. It's an exponential increase in vegetable oils, and with that, you see exponential increases of all of the chronic diseases, from coronary heart disease to hypertension, cancers, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, age-related macular degeneration, all the autoimmune diseases, and overweight and obesity, and then all of even the rare diseases, the things that have come up in the last 40 years that physicians all over the world are just scratching their head saying, what is this? And they don't even have names for all these conditions that have come up. There's just thousands of them that, especially children are suffering with today. And I won't make a big deal of that, but it truly is another part of the problem. But we've poisoned our food supply. And it's not because linoleic acid is a poison. It is required I don't have the slightest suspicion that it is not required. Burr, way back in 1931, confirmed that animals could not remain healthy if they did not have tiny amounts of fat, and that fat included linoleic, 18-carbon omega-6 linoleic acid and 18-carbon omega-3 alpha-linolenic acid. That's how those were determined to be essential fatty acids. That's the only two fats we need. But no matter what you eat, if it's food, it will have those. It doesn't matter. If you think of things, that most of us would consider that that when I was uneducated, we would all, I would have thought of as fat-free, like oranges or apples or white rice or potatoes or whatever. Every single one of those has fat, and they all contain omega-6 and omega-3, LA and ALA, those two fatty acids. And you will get them in the amounts that you need, no matter what you eat, as long as it's not a food prepared in a lab where they 100% extracted all of the fat.
Yeah, I think it's really important to return back to remember, every single fat that you consume is not a single type of fat. It is some combination of saturated, polyunsaturated, and mono. And so when you think of tallow is rendered beef fat. That is what our ancestors used for millennia. And now it's bad, right? It's actually very high in MUFA. So it's kind of closer to 40% MUFA, something like that. And it does contain some amount of PUFA, but that's close to 2%. And so it's just important to put this into context. When people talk about the essential fatty acids, there's a lot of controversy around the Burr experiments, but when people talk about the essential fatty acids, they say, oh, these are essential, so the more the better. No. We've taken that completely out of context. And if you just consume eggs, milk, meat, you're going to get plenty of these essential fatty acids. You don't need to go overboard and add more. And that's what our ancestors did. And this is why I think Chris's research is so important. He studied the percentage of these fatty acids in diets. And like you said, did you say linoleic acid, which is an omega-6, it was under 2% previously? And what did you say it is now?
It's in the United States, it was 11.8% in 2008, and it might be higher.
Can you imagine what it is today? That was a long time ago.
It's probably higher. Yeah, we don't have data past 2008, but interestingly, the vegetable oil consumption has continued to climb somewhat after 2008. But we continue to supplant and replace our animal fats, just as you were just alluding to, with these vegetable oils. And so, yeah, we might even be we might be higher than that. But the United States consumes more vegetable oil per capita per day than any nation in the world. We consume. So think of this: we consumed 0 grams in 1865. 1.62 grams of vegetable oils in 1900, 19.5 grams in 1961, and 80 grams in 2008. And it shouldn't then come as a surprise that of the developed nations, we have the highest obesity, right? I think we have among the highest coronary heart disease. We have a very high level of cancer. We have a very high level of diabetes, by nowhere near the highest in the world. But all of these things amongst the developed nations, I think that we have the worst health of all developed nations in the world. It's arguable for sure.
Have you seen the data from WHO that the United States is the only developed nation with a decline in both our healthy life expectancy and our life expectancy. So healthy life expectancy is the length of time that we live without a chronic disease. And then obviously life expectancy is our length of our life. And so why is this declining when we're seeing all these technological advances? Is it maybe with how we're eating? I think so.
Yeah.
And so it's honestly just astounding. And I don't see it really, I don't see the nutrition paradigm changing much in mainstream, which is really disheartening to me. And a big issue I see is so much of the agricultural industry, like there's so much government subsidies going towards the production of corn and soy. And so
Right.
when we are overproducing these crops that didn't really exist much in early 1900 to this degree, when we're overproducing these crops, we got to find a use for them, right? And then also when you overproduce things, the price drops a ton, right? And so
Right.
these food companies are like, oh, this is a cheap ingredient so I can make more money. Like you can't be mad at food manufacturing companies. They're simply improving their profit margins.
Hmm.
But the biggest problem is like we have an abundance of these things, these vegetable oils and all of these cheap food ingredients, and that includes things like flax seeds and fish oil and all these like food byproducts. We're producing them in abundance, and so there's just it's cheap ingredients that didn't exist 100 years ago. And so like Chris said, like in a small doses, it's not going to cause them any problems. But when we are forcefully putting these in our day-to-day diets, that is going to change our health, unfortunately. And so the fatty acid composition of our diet is tilting in the wrong direction.
Right. Right. Yes, and just exactly what you said. And the United States spends more money per capita on healthcare than any nation in the world, and we don't rank in the top 40, I believe, of developed nations in health. So it's you can't and people used to think, I think so many of our patients in general, from if you're a typical allopathic physician, you judge your patients their idea about health based on, do they follow what you tell them to do, which is mostly take the medicine you prescribe, and it ain't working.
Mm-hmm.
The typical patient has a bag of pills. If they come in on for a new patient, as a new patient, they come in with this bag of pills, and they've got all these medical problems, and obviously none of those pills will ever cure any of those conditions. None of them. I mean,
No.
and unless it's an infection, they're not curing anything.
So
So we
speaking of
need to we need to educate the world that the only way to get healthy is through returning to ancestral diets. And we can just go every possible direction with those. I mean, I think there's so many ways you can do that. But there's one way to do it wrong, and that's a standard American diet or a westernized diet. And that's with processed foods, refined flours, sugars, and vegetable oils. That's what, the kind of the key trio that you really need to try to eliminate.
So before we dive into kind of how to reduce your consumption and like what ancestral eating means, I think it's always important to address that like a lot of this data on the PUFA consumption and all these chronic diseases, it is epidemiological. And a lot of people poo-poo that because it's like, oh, that's association. Well, it's pretty clear once you understand physiology and you can break down the pathology of how this high PUFA consumption is leading to these chronic diseases. So I'll start on a few things that I can think of, but I'd love to kind of dive into what you know about the connection between PUFAs and like macular degeneration. So I think it's important to consider, again, the food that you eat makes up what you are inside. And this is particularly important for the fats that you consume. So we've got carbohydrates, fats, and protein. Carbohydrates are largely, when you consume them, they're largely burned off as energy, or they're stored in your muscles as glycogen, or stored in your liver as glycogen, or a very small percentage are stored as dietary fat. I want to say the de novo lipogenesis is like 2% or less.
Right.
So when we consider fats and protein, fats can also be used as an energy source. but they're also used as a structural component inside of our body, and so are proteins. And so when we dive into the fats, the percentage that you eat is vital, because what we're burning for fuel, we're like, let's say that our engines were burning fuel, omega-6 linoleic acid, that's pretty crappy fuel. And so it oxidizes readily. And so there's a lot of toxic byproducts, toxic metabolites from oxidizing these fatty acids and using them as energy. And so you can imagine, after years and years and years of this, you've got this collection of these damaged toxic byproducts that are going to wreak havoc inside your body, right? And in terms of like, then the fat you consume is also creating structures inside your body. You're literally controlling the internal environment of your body by the types of fat that you consume. Like, to me, that is powerful. That's empowering, because you can change the fatty acid structure inside of you by what you consume. And we've seen this in countless studies, and we've seen this in animal studies. I know for a fact it takes 30 days to change the fatty acid composition of chickens. It takes 3 months to change the fatty acid composition of pigs. And it takes 2 to 4 years to change the fatty acid composition of what's inside of you. And so when we understand that the types of fat that we consume changes the internal environment of your body, you can then understand why certain enzymatic reactions or your metabolism or your thyroid health or your energy production capabilities is all changed by the types of fat that you consume. And there's plenty of data now showing that omega-6 PUFAs, and especially omega-6 linoleic acid, it literally downregulates your metabolism. It has a damaging effect to your metabolism, meaning the amount of calories that your body is burning, you have to consume less calories to maintain your weight. And this is shown by really cool data. I believe Fire in a Bottle has demonstrated that the earliest evidence of USDA data on total caloric consumption of Americans showed that people were consuming like 3,500 calories way back in 1900. They weren't obese. They had much better metabolisms because they weren't consuming high PUFA diets that are down regulating the metabolism. That's well documented and well known. And now we have people who can't even maintain their weight on 2,000 calories. It's crazy to me. So that's my major, when I think of like how and why a high PUFA consumption is leading to these diseases. It goes back to energy production. And when we don't have enough energy, we can't function properly. And so then our body has to make like compensations. And then over time, things are going to break. What would you like to add on to like, what is the mechanism for why this huge shift in the types of fat that we're consuming is leading to these chronic diseases?
Yeah, great question, Ashley, and it's a huge question. Of course, let me start with I want to give a little bit of further evidence regarding this, from epidemiology before I get to the pathophysiology. Okay, so the first thing I want to say, kind of related to what you were just saying, why is it that are we just consuming more calories? We certainly did, and for a while, up through around 2000 or so, you could see that could account, that alone could account for our obesity epidemic. But very interestingly, Darius Monteferian, who quite honestly doesn't, he follows the typical allopathic kind of thinking, just published a paper that shows that the total caloric availability per person in the U.S., as well as the total consumed calories in the U.S. since the year 2000 has not changed, while the obesity has gone through from 31% to 42.5%.
Whoa, wait,
Right?
you've got to send me that link, and I will definitely include that in the show notes. That's huge.
It is huge. Okay, so calories have not changed since 1997. So for those who think, well, it's, but it's the carbohydrates. Since 1997, at least through 2013, that's the latest data available that I have, or could come up with, carbohydrates have been on the decline in the United States. Since 1999 or 2004, depending on two slightly different data sets, sugar consumption has been on the decline in the United States. So you've got calorie state. Oh, and by one other metric, total calories have been going down a little bit since 2002. Down. Okay, while obesity goes through the roof, diabetes goes way through the roof, and metabolic syndrome goes through the roof, right? And cancer is still, I believe, on the increase. I don't think I can prove that last one about cancer, though. So what is it? But the one thing that continues to increase is the vegetable oils and the omega-6 consumption because of that. All right. So what does this do to us? Well, it's exactly like Ashley was saying. That's the perfect start. I would say, there's 4 pillars of hazard that I point out when we discuss the problems with high omega-6 containing diets, and it's that they're pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient. And you put those 4 pillars of hazard together, and you have the recipe for disaster.
That's
And
the best. That's the best summary of omega-6s I've heard. So I'm excited. Let's dive into these 4. That's really cool.
Okay, and I'll make it quick, Ashley.
No. I want to make this super crystal clear for people, because I think there's all of these blanket statements of just omega-6s and vegetable oils are bad, but no one really explains why.
Okay.
And so let's dive into those 4. That's exciting.
Okay. So, as far as them being pro-oxidative, well, when you consume high omega-6s, as we've already alluded to, they accumulate in your body fat. And this is proven. In fact, there is a perfect correlation essentially between omega-6 rich seed oils in the diet and the omega-6 in your body fat. And when it's in your body fat, it also means that it's in your cell membranes, it's in your mitochondrial membranes, it's everywhere you have fat.
You are what you eat.
Right. And so we should be there's 4 ancestrally living populations studied by Ian Pryor and colleagues back in 1969 in New Zealand and in Puka Puka. These 4 different populations, then they had an average body fat omega-6 linoleic acid of 2.86%. All right. That's where we should be. Those are ancestral people. That's the only 4 studies of completely ancestrally living populations that had their body fat analyzed for fatty acids in all of history that is at that level. I mean, they had perfect diets and had that level. All right. Well, where were Americans in comparison? By 1959, we were at 9.1% omega-6 LA in our body fat. And by 2008, we were at 21.5% omega-6 LA. All right. The worst in the world is in Israel, and they were 25.6% in their body fat.
I imagine that the U.S. is closer to that percentage now in 2023.
I would bet so too. And again, and in parallel with all of these things, we see all of this chronic disease and obesity going through the roof, and all of the allopathic and conventional researchers and physicians, they all are just scratching their heads. Well, what's causing this? We just don't know. They continue to report all of these drastic increases in all this disease, and you can't figure it out. But in any case, so let's get back to, well, what's driving this? Well, the omega-6 seed oils, when they accumulate in your body fat, they set up this biological milieu that, again, is pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, directly toxic, and nutrient deficient. So how about pro-oxidative? Well, that means that you're essentially, let's just keep it, start off at the 50,000 foot view. It's like we're rusting inside. Why is this? Well, again, the unsaturated fats, which these are polyunsaturated fats, they have 2 or more double bonds, and this includes both omega-6 and omega-3. They are more subject to oxidative attack. Well, we make, I can't tell you how many numbers, 1 times 10 to the 21st hydroxyl radicals is an approximate number for a man in one day That is a staggering figure. Can't tell you how big that is. We also make singlet oxygen, superoxide radicals, hydrogen peroxide, all of these things that can oxidize these fats. So the free radicals, they're always there. They're natural. But if you fill up your body with these unsaturated fats, now there's something for them to burn, for something for them to attack. And I just say this is like, go ahead, Ashley.
Well, it's important to remember saturated fats, they don't have that double bond. And so
Right.
when these free radicals go to a saturated fat, it doesn't have the same oxidation potential. There isn't this damaging cascade of like harmful inflammatory reactions happening. Whereas the PUFAs have those, it's basically like a driveway for these free radicals to come in. It says, welcome, come in and oxidize me.
Right. The saturated fats are by far the most resistant to oxidation, followed by the monounsaturated fats, which has a very low potential, and then the polyunsaturated fats, which is omega-6 and omega-3s, they have very high potential. So if if saturated fat is approximately 0 to 1, I believe it is, polyunsaturated fat oxidation potential is about 25. So it's about 25-fold more likely to oxidize when there are free radicals around.
Can you just, in the most simplest terms, just briefly tell the audience, like, what does oxidation mean and why is that a problem?
Okay,
We don't have to go into
oxidation
chemistry.
means that you lose electrons, and this changes the molecule in a way that is damaging. So this is damaging to everything that becomes oxidized, whether it's, you're primarily concerned about your fats oxidizing, but you also can oxidize your proteins, even your carbohydrates and your nucleic acids, so like DNA and RNA. These could they're all subject to undergoing oxidation, which means that they are permanently and irreversibly harmed in many cases.
Is it kind of like just a bunch of car accidents happening?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
So like, whereas when there's saturated fats, everyone's in their lane, we're driving straight. And then when there's a ton of oxidation with PUFAs, there's just car accidents happening left and right, and it's non-reversible. You can't just take that back. And as a result of these car accidents, there's all these things flying off, causing damage everywhere.
absolutely. Perfect analogy. Right. So one of the main things that happens in oxidation is that you can oxidize your cardiolipin, a type of fat that is prominent in our inner mitochondrial membranes. And this cardiolipin molecule, which has normally in the heart has 4 linoleic acid tails, when those tails, when they oxidize, they have a conformational shape change, and that shape change changes the functionality of the inner mitochondrial membrane, and it can change the way that it bends, and it can change it in a way that it creates pores in that membrane. Well, that membrane has to hold a hydrogen proton gradient. Normally, you build a hydrogen proton gradient when you're trying to produce energy. In other words, when you're trying to convert ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to ATP, adenosine triphosphate, you phosphorylate that ADP to ATP using hydrogen protons and the gradient. Well, when you lose that gradient, you can't produce it properly. You lose it because of these pores in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Now you can't produce energy properly. And the thing that happens simultaneous with that is 2 things, Ashley. Number one is it increases reactive oxygen species coming out of the electron transport chain. And that feeds back into a feedback loop that creates more damaged fats, and it also causes the cell to immediately become insulin resistant. And I believe that the cell becomes insulin resistant because the cell is sick. I mean, you've damaged your mitochondria in this way. So you've limited mitochondrial function. And I believe then that the cell begins to store the fat. we're wondering why we have, fatty liver disease and fats, increasing fat storage, while, and in the brain and in the retina, we see lipofuscin, we call this. And these are all cases where we see oxidized fats within the cell being stored. Why are they being stored? Well, when you shut down your electron transport chain, you shut down mitochondrial function. So again, why is it that all of these diseases, from obesity to cancer to Alzheimer's to age-related macular degeneration to Parkinson's and on, why diabetes, why are all these diseases connected together by mitochondrial dysfunction? This is why, because your damage is primarily driven by this high omega-6 fat diet. Okay, so that's part of oxidation. The second part of oxidation is about this, the toxicity part of the seed oil problem. So when you consume seed oils and you develop this high level, again, when they're acted upon by a free radical, the first thing that happens is you produce a lipid hydroperoxide. And those lipid hydroperoxides, they rapidly degenerate into advanced lipid oxidation end products. And these are components like 4-hydroxynonenal, which is 4-H&E, malondialdehyde or MDA, carboxyethyl pyrrole, acrolein, and then there's others that are sometimes called oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, which are typically 9 and 13-HOD. And then there's literally hundreds of others, Ashley, of these advanced lipid oxidation end products that these lipid scientists have figured out. And now these could be produced in these oils, especially when they're heated, which they are in their production. But guess what? All of these things can be created in your body because of oxidative attack. And so, well, what's the problem with all of these ALs, these advanced lipid oxidation end products? Well, collectively, they are cytotoxic, genotoxic, mutagenic, carcinogenic, atherogenic, thrombogenic, obesogenic, and diabetogenic. I mean, could we get any worse?
So basically, the oxidation of PUFAs is going to lead to not only damage inside your body, but then also very toxic and damaging molecules and compounds that can just continue this damage cascade in other areas throughout the body. Is that right?
Right. Exactly. Okay. Right. Okay. So that's basically the toxicity. So that's, maybe pillar number 3. And I'm going to go back to kind of pillar number 2, inflammation. Associated with seed oil consumption. Now, this is the one that all of the world accepts, that omega-6 produces higher levels of inflammatory products. Why is this? Well, because omega-6 linoleic acid is converted by elongase and desaturase enzymes to arachidonic acid, and the downstream metabolites of arachidonic acid are inflammatory prostaglandins, leukotrienes, thromboxanes, and eicosanoids. And those collectively cause inflammation, vasoconstriction, and clotting, right? And so this is totally accepted. There's not a researcher in the world that disagrees with that part. And opposing that is the omega-3s, that they are anti-inflammatory, anti-vasoconstriction, so they're vasodilating and anti-clotting, right? So that's why the omega-3s have been touted as, so good, and we want to take a whole bunch of that. Well, I don't believe in that either, but
okay, wait, let's dive into that just really briefly, because I think that this is the biggest issue with mainstream health, because when we see something as being good, we always promote it as the more the better. Mm-hmm. And so of course, Western medicine is now saying, omega-3s are powerful because it's a short-term suppression of the damage that's being done by these omega-6s. So I fully believe that a lot of this high omega-3 consumption that's being pushed, it's simply serving as symptom suppression and immunosuppression, which then dampens the amount of inflammatory signals that we're getting, but we're not changing we're not changing the types of fats in our body. We shouldn't be drastically increasing our omega-3 consumption. Consume less omega-6 and prioritize saturated fats. Like, that's the direction we should be heading, not, oh, omega-3s are going to save us all. When you dive into omega-3s, the profit margins are so high on fish oil, flaxseed, all of these things that people are pushing in like astronomical quantities. Again, significantly higher than a lot of our ancestors have consumed evolutionarily. I just dove in there. I'm sorry, but I would love to hear your take on the omega-3 side of these things.
Right. Well, the bottom line, I'll say that first. You can't fix this with omega-3. You cannot fix it with omega-3. No way, shape, or form. The reason that, in part, I'll make this very simple, is that omega-3 was thought to be so beneficial is because as you go down the metabolic pathways where omega-6s, like omega-6 linoleic acid, is converted to arachidonic acid and then to the inflammatory mediators, and on the other side of that pathway where the omega-3 alpha linolenic acid is then converted to the longer chain omega-3 fatty acids like EPA and DHA, and then those downstream products, which are resolvins, protectins, and myrisins, again, the things that are anti-inflammatory, well, those both use the same elongase and desaturase enzymes in those metabolic pathways. So if you plugged in a whole bunch of omega-3, the thinking goes, you will short circuit the pathway and you will get more anti-inflammatory and less inflammatory, but it doesn't seem to work this way. Why? Well, it's just because, when you fill up your body with these omega-6s, your body is going to process them. But this is just, again, this inflammation versus anti-inflammation. This is just one pillar that we're looking at. And by the way, Ashley, I just want to say, I think that, oxidation is 100 times worse than inflammation overall. Maybe I'm wrong there, but it's probably, at least in my view, it's just phenomenally worse. I mean, if you think about the things that are highly oxidative, like arsenic, it will literally kill you in hours. Well, this is exactly what seed oils do. They do the same kinds of things because they're both highly pro-oxidative. And so it's not inflammation that is so incredibly dangerous overall in comparison. It's oxidation.
Yeah,
So
because isn't inflammation kind of like it's like a protective thing of our body saying like, we got to fix this, and inflammation can ultimately be reversed and reduced, but oxidation is kind of damage like that you can't really undo. Is that kind of true?
I couldn't have said it better. I
But
think that is exactly right.
so then this is an interesting thing because omega-3s are still polyunsaturated fatty acids. They still have those double bonds that are susceptible to oxidation. And so this is why I don't think it's a good idea to overdo. Again, like you said in the beginning, I love that. Nothing is toxic in small doses, and we shouldn't be fear mongering certain things. But when we are consuming these things in very unancestrally traditional ratios and pounding down omega-3s, omega-3s are still are not stable. Saturated fats are the most stable fatty acids. And so I worry about long term switching the fatty acid profile inside of us to a ton of omega-3s, because then we're just going to be adding more and more oxidation over time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can see why there would be short term benefits because it would reduce the inflammation signal. But gosh, I truly don't think that that's a long term thinking solution. And like you just said, the research is pointing that you can't fix this issue with omega-3s.
Absolutely. And if you think about, and as you know, I love population studies because you can learn so incredibly much by looking at all of these different populations who consume vastly different kinds of diets and yet have extraordinary health in comparison to us, at least, and in general maybe extraordinary health. In fact, I think 19th century Americans, might think I'm going off on a tangent here, Ashley, but I'll come back to this omega-3 just in 1 second. But I think 19th century Americans may have been one of the healthiest populations on the planet. I really do. And think about this: the enormous majority of them lived inland. They had no access to the sea. They didn't have access to rivers or lakes where they could even get fish and or seafood from the sea. And so their diet was mostly that what they prized was, in terms of meat, was beef, and a lot more pork in the South. But in any case, I'm convinced that 95% of them, probably around, somewhere in that range, didn't have access to seafood or fish regularly. And yet, why was there no coronary heart disease, or never a case? There was never a case of Alzheimer's in the 19th century. There was not a case of macular degeneration in the United States in the 19th century. Why was obesity 1.2% in men age 18 to 80? Why was diabetes 2.8 per 100,000 people, whereas it's 13,000 per 100,000 today? Why all these things? Okay, it wasn't because they were consuming huge amounts of omega-3. They had almost none. What they got was coming from beef, mostly, and pork. That's where their omega-3 was going. And some of the fruits and vegetables, the tiny amounts they would get from that. And it was probably, their diet was about 1.1% omega-6. It was probably 0.3 to 0.6 or 0.7% omega-3 is my guess, somewhere in that range.
That's low.
So it's very, very low.
Yeah.
Yeah. And people say, well, we just need more omega-3. Guess what, folks? The omega-3 consumption almost doubled in the 20th century in the United States.
Wow.
This is Tanya Blasbog's research. Yeah, can't remember the exact numbers, Ashley, but if you look at that data, from 1909 through 2008, I believe that data goes, or 2005, somewhere in there. The omega-3 consumption, the omega-6 went through the roof, right? It went up about 8 or 10-fold just during that period, but the omega-3 almost doubled. And so you can't peg this on the lack of of omega-3. The fact that it went up so much, and yet our health is a disaster, doesn't suggest to me that our problem's lack of omega-3. I mean, you see populations all over that don't have access to high omega-3 foods, and they're very, very healthy.
And then people are going to say, oh, well, Chris, it's the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. That's our issue. No, this is why I appreciate Chris's work so much. Chris goes back to, forget all of that silly nonsense. Let's look at the percentages in the diet, because that's the important piece. And when you look at these healthy populations, look, the PUFA consumption was low. You just have to accept that. They prioritized saturated and monounsaturated fats.
Right.
And so that's why it just makes so much more sense thinking of it that way, because imagine how hard it is to be perfect with your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And that just seems, our ancestors didn't do that. So
no, right.
Yeah.
And there is a fair amount of data that I think pretty strongly suggests that we're not fixing this problem with higher omega-3. It just doesn't work. It's proven, for example, that it doesn't work in macular degeneration, as just one example. I'm not convinced it works for anything, really. It may be a short-term solution. It might help a little bit, but it's not a long-term solution.
It's funny because when you read through the literature, when you read through what these researchers are saying, you can hear the bias in their words. So a very common line is, despite the well-known health benefits of polyunsaturated fatty acids, they're highly unstable molecules. And so it's like, why are we how are unstable molecules healthy for us? And when you understand, when you go to the reference that they're saying that it's healthy for humans, it all goes back to, oh, PUFAs lower serum cholesterol.
That's
And
it.
statin companies need you to believe that so that they can keep making billions of dollars every year. And so there's so much money being poured into this low cholesterol equals good, and saturated fat consumption raises your cholesterol, so that's bad. And PUFAs lower your cholesterol, so that's good. No. It's maddening. It's maddening.
Yeah, as I've always said, okay, absolutely, vegetable oils, high omega-6 does indeed lower your cholesterol. So does arsenic. It's true. And again, and there's many, many parallels. I have a, a, a folder. It's my, and I had put it into two, but it's literally like this thick of papers looking at, what happens in so-called, low dose chronic poisoning with arsenic. And, it's the outcomes are identical to what the poisoning we're getting with seed oils. I mean, identical. Like if it doesn't kill you, like if you get a small dose in your water supply, let's say, over years, kind of like vegetable oils, you will typically become obese, you'll become diabetic, you can develop heart rhythm disturbances, atherosclerosis, congestive heart failure, diabetes, or did I say it already? Metabolic syndrome, all of these things that we're getting with vegetable oils, and everybody's just scratching their head like we just can't figure out what this is about. Well, I mean, I'm not, and I don't mean to imply that vegetable oils are the only problem. I mean, it's processed foods are the main problem, of course, and and the nutrient deficiencies are a big part of that. But anyway, but I never got to pillar number 4. Can I go
So,
back to that?
yeah, wait. Pillar 1 is
Yeah,
oxidation.
yeah.
Pillar
Pro-oxidative and
pro-oxidative. Pillar 2
pro-
was
pro-inflammatory.
pro-inflammatory. Pillar 3 was just straight toxic
Toxicity. Yep.
toxicity.
That's
And
those advanced lipid oxidation end products. And then
yep.
pillar 4, yeah, would be nutrient deficiency. And so the point here is that this harkens back to Weston A. Price's research that the fat soluble vitamins A, D, and K2 are so fundamentally critical. And nobody wants to talk about this anymore. I guess it's just not sexy, but it's so incredibly important that we get these fat soluble vitamins in sufficient quantities. And I just don't, everywhere I look, I don't believe that we are, from the severe atherosclerosis and calcification we see in our arteries, from our severe cancer rates. Everything you look at, essentially, we're deficient in these vitamins. And that's a long story, but suffice it to say that absolutely none of the vegetable oils, and I mean even the good ones, if you want to talk about coconut oil and palm kernel oil that are 2% omega-6 linoleic acid and good quality, authentic olive oil, these, and in fact, all of the oils do not contain one atom worth, one molecule worth of these fat soluble vitamins A, D, and K2. They will have K1 and E, but those vitamins, but they won't have A, D, and K2, the ones that are so fundamentally critical. And we're again supplanting and replacing our our animal fats with these vegetable oils, adding to our nutrient deficiency. So this is another pillar of it. So again, you put those hazards together: pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficiency, and now you've got, again, this complete recipe for disaster. And this is where we are today.
On the vitamin E part of it, I read a study that showed, okay, so I think it's important to remember vitamin E can kind of serve as an antioxidant. So when you have this oxidation of these fatty acid molecules, these PUFAs, unstable fatty acid molecules, it's going to go from one double bond to another. And it's just like a domino effect, right? There's just like oxidation just goes. Vitamin E can be a chain breaker, and so it can stop the oxidation. However, And so many advocates or people who are like pro plant and seed oils, they'll say, oh, seed oils contain high levels of vitamin E. And so that is true for many nuts and seeds. Those are high in vitamin E.
Mm-hmm.
However, people don't report the vitamin E levels that remain once we consume them. So they may have high levels of vitamin E at one point, but the vitamin E levels get used up by the fats inside the vegetable oil, the nuts, and the seeds
Mm-hmm.
as oxidation occurs. So vitamin E is used up. And so then by the time that we actually consume the vegetable oil, the vitamin E isn't really there anymore because it was used to keep the fat stable in the bottle. Think of like a vegetable oil bottle that's just exposed to grocery store light all day, or it's shipped from some manufacturing plant to God knows where in the rest of the country in hot tankers. That vitamin E is used up inside the oil when oxidation is happening because of heat, light, or oxygen. And so then by the time we consume it, there's no vitamin E, and then we're just consuming PUFAs. And there's plenty of research showing that as our PUFA intake increases, our vitamin E needs rise. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're consuming these vitamin E void seed oils. And then the USDA has never measured, like when they measured fat soluble vitamins in these animal products, they just assumed that it doesn't contain vitamin E. But there's actually some data showing that tallow does contain some levels of vitamin E. So, just a long story to just continue that fourth pillar of like, it's not only nutrient devoid, but then because we're replacing these fats with because we're replacing the traditional animal fats with these others, we're missing out on just vital nutrients.
Yeah, that is such a great point, Ashley. And for a long time, I wondered because I don't do this often, but I occasionally will track all of my nutrients that I'm getting in my diet. And one of the things that started to concern me, because it always looked like, according to my intake, that my vitamin E was low. And the reason that it is because in the typical Western diet, the primary source of vitamin E is vegetable oils. And, so if you just look across the board at the intakes of nutrients, this is another one of the fundamental problems is it's based on, Westernized diets and Westernized people and in terms of outcomes. Well, anyway, so so then I started, with my nutrition testing, when I look at my own, serum nutrients, I looked at vitamin E, and I've done this 2 or 3 times, and it's off the charts high. Well, I don't get a gram of vegetable oils really anywhere. I mean, I really try to avoid it as much as I possibly can. And we can talk more about diet. But anyway, but yeah, my vitamin E is actually very, very high. And where am I getting that? It's coming from my good quality, ancestrally raised meats, eggs, and sometimes raw milk, and a little bit, and some other dairy, and then just other ancestral fruits and vegetables, ancestral foods, fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
That's where it's coming from. So
Yeah.
it's not high by American standards. It's low, but it's very high in my blood.
Yeah. Because your needs are lower because you consume
Yes,
less PUFAs.
absolutely.
So, can we now talk about some tips for the audience to reduce their consumption of PUFAs? So, what are going to be foods that are going to be high levels of PUFAs and kind of things that you should try to reduce your consumption of?
Yeah, so there's really 3 ways to get your omega-6 or your PUFAs down. And it's number one is eliminate the highly polyunsaturated vegetable oils. Number two would
So,
be,
I think it's important. People think that like grapeseed oil is like good,
Mhm.
but that's really high. And people think like sunflower oil. So we're talking like all the oils. So like
Yeah,
corn
I'll go through
oil.
all of them.
Yeah, yeah.
I can go through all of them. Yeah, so just really quick, just big picture first is,
Okay.
for 3 things. Number one, let's just say eliminate seed oils. Number
Yep.
two is eliminate or reduce CAFO raised, that's concentrated animal feeding operation raised chicken and pork or pigs that are fed corn and soy. And number three is reduce nuts and seeds. And we can go through each one. So as far as the vegetable oils, Ashley, I tell people the main oils you want to remove are what we would kind of classically call the seed oils. That's really it. And one of them is soybean. So it's soybeans, soybean oil, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, sesame, and peanut oils. It's a long list, but those all range in omega-6 LA from about 20% to 78%.
I want to
As
say,
compared to,
isn't grapeseed one of the highest? I know that safflower and sunflower are way up there.
yeah, I think that safflower and sunflower are the highest. They're about 76,
That's
78%. I don't know
oh
what, I can't remember
yeah,
what rapeseed is,
yeah.
but it's somewhere in that range. It's like 60 some or 70%, I believe. I'm not dead sure.
So it's just important to remember that like these things just didn't exist over 100 years ago. We didn't have the manufacturing technology to be able to take large quantities of corn kernels and turn that into a big thing of vegetable oil. It takes an insane amount of corn to create this corn oil, insane amount of soybeans. Like this just wasn't possible by our ancestors, and so it just simply wasn't a part of their diet. So
Right.
cut those out. Just cut it out. So then what's two?
Yeah. So let me just say real quick that because there's always a question about, well, can I use this oil, that oil, olive oil, avocado oil? So really quickly, I'll just say there's of the other categories. So with that, the first category we just discussed was the seed oils. The second would be, let's just call them fruit oils. And
Yeah.
this would be like olive oil and avocado oil. And avocado oil is about 14% omega-6 linoleic acid.
Oh
It
wow.
should be, it's sort of okay. It's definitely a healthy oil if it was truly authentic, relatively healthy. Certainly not anything like butter, lard, or beef tallow that are all around 2% omega-6 LA. Um, and then you have olive oil that averages about 10% omega-6 LA, but it ranges from around 3% to 27%, I believe it is.
Oh
Or
wow.
it might be 22%, but it's something like that with an average of around 10%. The problem with avocado oil and olive oil is that they are typically adulterated in westernized countries. You just cannot avoid it. 79% of the olive oils, according to the North American Olive Oil Association, are not of good quality. They're either adulterated or they can't meet good quality extra virgin olive oil standards by their standards. And that tells you something about how much. So 4 out of 5 bottles of oil out there are not good, so-called olive oil, are either adulterated or they're not good quality. So you got to be very careful. You can go to that organization and it'll help you to find an olive oil that if you want to use it, if you want to consume that, I would say make absolutely sure you're getting an authentic oil, that it's kept in a dark bottle, it's kept in a dark place that's relatively cool or not hot, and use it soon. Like it should probably be consumed in 6 weeks.
And what he means by adulterated is, again, these food manufacturing companies are realizing, if I use 20% vegetable oil, I can reduce my input costs and raise my profits. And so they actually mix in vegetable oil in with the olive oil. And I don't even think they have to report it because there's just not enough regulation around it. And so, yeah, like you said, make sure you're buying quality, go through it quickly. So maybe buy smaller bottles of it, like not huge bulk bottles, buy
Yeah,
smaller glass dark bottles.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, so I don't consume olive oil. I mean, I will on occasion if I feel it's authentic and it's fresh, but I just avoid it because it's just hard to find olive oils that are really good quality. And I just don't think it can't begin to compare to butter. Good, just good quality grass-fed butter, because again, butter is 2% omega-6 LA, so it's way lower than the typical olive oil, and it also has some vitamins A, D, and probably a tiny bit of K2.
So
So
for your fats you're consuming, prioritize the butter, tallow, ghee, and then if you can tolerate coconut oil, you can use that sparingly because it's relatively highly saturated. But some people
yeah,
don't respond well to coconut oil. So, okay.
right. Right.
Okay.
And then there's really quickly, then there'd be the tropical oils. That's coconut oil, palm oil, and palm kernel oils. So coconut and palm kernel are both about 2% omega-6 linoleic acid. They would be excellent oils to use for cooking. As Ashley said, some people don't tolerate coconut oil well. Palm oil is about 10% LA. It is heat treated in many situations. So, but it would be a decent oil as compared to the seed oils. I mean, it certainly would be far cry better than those. But again, I just would, I would say in general that my favorite choices would be coconut oil or a good quality authentic olive oil, but none of them can beat butter in my
Yep.
view.
Yep.
None of them.
Exactly. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's pillar one for
Yeah.
reducing your consumption is to prioritize those ancestral fats. And then two, you said reduce your consumption of confinement chicken and pork.
Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah.
so
So
I think,
Ashley knows this better than I do. Do you want? Would you rather tell it?
yeah, but Chris, I think that we spend our free time similarly. I just love studying the literature. I think it's
I do
enjoy
too.
like I like reading it. It's kind of how I think, very technical. And so let's return back to ruminant fats in a second. But basically, monogastric animals, meaning single stomach animals, we're monogastric, chickens are monogastric, and pigs are monogastric. And so the types of fat that we consume that directly affects the types of fat inside the body. And so when you think of pigs and chickens, if they're fed high PUFA, their fat and their eggs are going to be high PUFA. It's just it's well documented, right? And so of course the literature is saying, look at how healthy the fatty acid profile of the chicken and pork is by feeding corn and soy. We can
Mm,
reduce the artery clogging saturated fat and increase the percentage of the cholesterol lowering polyunsaturated fats. It's all nonsense. And
right.
so they're, unfortunately, because these animals are just in confinement, they're just, that's all they're given is high PUFA ingredients. And so you may have the data. I don't know the exact statistics, but there's been a dramatic increase in the percentage of PUFAs, just like humans, where we have gone from 2% of our fat to now over 20, maybe 25% of our fat is linoleic acid PUFA. Do you
Mhm.
know the percentage increase that we've seen with chicken, meat, eggs, and pork? It's got to be
Um,
similar, right?
yeah, the only studies that I'm aware of where they analyzed the body fat fatty acid profiles in chickens and pigs was in Ian Pryor's research in Tokelau in 1969, I believe it was, or maybe 72, somewhere in there. Anyway, these were these were ancestrally fed chickens and pigs, and they ate a lot of coconut. They were like the people, they were eating probably a lot of what the people ate, is my guess. As if you don't know it, listeners, viewers, the chickens are they love to eat meat. I mean, they're omnivores. They eat meat and fruits or vegetables. They'll eat. Well, you could tell them what they eat, actually, but anyway, they're not vegetarians. They're
No.
not vegans. They like to eat. They eat like kind of like people do, and of course, that's what pigs do. They're also omnivores. But anyway, so on that island of Tokelau, the pigs, their omega-6 linoleic acid in their body fat was 2%, and in the chickens was 2.5%. Right, and today in CAFO raised chickens and pork, they get up to right around 20% omega-6 LA. So they're
I've
right up there
seen
with Americans.
I've seen one study that showed 25.6% for chicken meat.
Yeah, nice. That's, I mean, it's disastrous, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting because the 20%, that's about where Americans are today. Like you said, that we might be higher, and
Yeah.
the 25.6%, that's almost precisely what the population in Israel was
Yeah.
here recently.
So
Yeah,
basically what's happening with humans is happening with chickens and pigs. And so if you're going to consume eggs, chicken, meat, and pork, try to find a good source. And shameless plug, Sarah and I are working on a co-op business where we are not only going to be able to supply our low PUFA corn and soy free eggs, but we're also expanding our product line, and we're going to be able to have our low PUFA corn and soy free chicken meat, low PUFA corn and soy free pork meat, and a lot more options. So it's tough. It is really tough to find farmers that are raising these chickens and pigs without conventional corn and soy feed, because the corn and soy free feed is astronomically more expensive because corn and soy is subsidized by the government. So those are very cheap feed ingredients. And so feed that doesn't contain those is going to be higher. And so if reducing your PUFA consumption is important to you, I wouldn't consume CAFO high PUFA chicken and pork every day. Of course, it's not going to kill you, but I don't think it should be a big percentage of your protein intake because that fat is going to add up.
right. Yeah, and I should just make a financial disclosure here myself, Ashley, that for those who don't know, I work for nonprofit organizations. We founded Cure AMD Foundation back in 2017, I believe it was, and then we a couple of years ago founded Ancestral Health Foundation. These are the entities through which I work and do research, but I am not paid. No one in our organizations is paid. We're volunteers. I'm a volunteer. I've already spent a career in medicine and ophthalmology, and I do this work because I believe it's my calling, and I love doing this work because I want to help everybody that I possibly can. Ashley is my friend, and we have collaborated together to do some laboratory studies on her eggs and chicken meat, which is absolutely brilliant. I get her chicken eggs, but we do not. I do not have any financial or relationship with Ashley, and we do not accept any industry funding in our foundations at all. We just won't do it. We won't create any kinds of relationships with any kind of organizations so that we remain completely unbiased, and no one can ever question what our motives are. We're not paid. We're not funded. The funding that we get comes from philanthropists, people like ourselves that look at this and say, my gosh, people are, they're suffering, they're going blind, they're dying, from all these disorders because of our food supply. Maybe I can make a difference. And these are the people that give of themselves and give of their funds. And that's what I have done myself for these organizations. So anyway, but the last thing I just want to say is that I am so glad that I can get your eggs. Otherwise, I would not be eating eggs. And I would love to get your chicken meat, pork meat, anything like that you could produce, because the way you raise it is, well, there's no one I could trust to raise, to get eggs like yours, or chicken, even chicken meat like yours if it was available. So I would like to get all of your food. But again,
Yeah.
that's where our relationship is. That's as far as it goes.
Yeah. So your foundation is literally incredible. So the foundation helped us fund it's expensive to get these fatty acid tests done. And so his incredible foundation helped fund a study to show that there is a significant difference in the fatty acid composition of our chickens versus chickens fed corn and soy. And unfortunately, a lot of feed companies aren't really aware of the problems with PUFAs. And so they just think, oh, people don't want corn and soy. And so then they use vegetable oil in the feed, but it's not corn and soy, but there's still vegetable oil. And then they replace the corn and soy with high PUFA ingredients like safflower, sunflower, flaxseed, fish oil, and things like that. And it's like, that's not solving any problems. You're just going from one problem to another. And so that is why I'm so confident and proud of what we've created at the farm, where we are low PUFA ingredients, just like our ancestors did 100 to 200 years ago. The chickens are not force fed PUFAs. And so as a result, their fatty acid composition is a reflection of what nature and God intended for these animals. It's not man made and tinkered by force feeding them PUFAs inside of a confinement barn. And so it's just, unfortunately, these like nutritional fallacies have infiltrated so many levels of our food system with not only packaged food, but also sometimes like what animals are eating, which is unfortunate. And I think that it's better for you to get these nutrients and consume chicken and pork products. But if you can, try to prioritize ones that aren't fed these high PUFA things, because those that PUFA intake will add up over time, unfortunately.
Right, and I just want to say, that we helped to fund the research, the studies, the fatty acid studies on Angel Acres Farms eggs. That's Ashley's organization, and the chicken meat, because we wanted that data so that we can publish that. Until that was done, we did not have there was not a single study available in the world where chickens were raised on ancestral diets and their eggs analyzed for for the fatty acid profile, to my knowledge. Right, same for you, Ashley. Right.
Correct.
Right. And so, and if I remember right, the number, I'm a pretty good numbers guy, but I think your eggs had 176 milligrams of omega-6 LA per egg on average. Is that the right number, or do you recall?
So the simplest way to explain the study results is you can consume 4 of our eggs and still consume less linoleic acid than 1 egg from a confinement barn.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it was roughly 700 or 800 milligrams. We'll put that into grams to be simpler. So under zero point 0.2 grams in Ashley's eggs per egg of omega-6 LA versus closer to 0.8 grams in the CAFO eggs, and the other ones were anywhere in between. So if you eat, you want to consume less than 5 grams, or about 5 grams of omega-6 LA per day, assuming you're consuming about 2,250 calories in a day. So it's going to go up or down a little bit if you're consuming less or a whole lot more. But anyway, if you're consuming the typical American diet and you're consuming about 2,250 calories, you should not consume more than about 5 grams of omega-6 LA per day. Well, if you ate 4 of Ashley's eggs, you're still only at like 0.7 grams of LA. You've not even you've only hit, I think it was 17% of your day's total in like 4 eggs. So if you ate 4 eggs from a CAFO, from CAFO raised eggs, at 0.8 grams a piece, now you're at 3.2 grams. You already satisfied 65, whatever that is, 65, 70% of your omega-6 LA consumption for the day.
Yeah.
That is a big problem. So in other words, you're just adding to the problem there, in my view. And there's a tremendous amount of evidence that shows this is really, really important, this number that you're not consuming more than 2% of your diet as LA. When you start getting above 3 or 4%, you're like, for example, the cancer incidence goes way up, and this is proven. This proven in a number of animal studies.
So a really easy way to do this would be to just track an average day of food on Chronometer, and then it'll tell you how much linoleic acid you're consuming, and then you can calculate the percentage. And so, like Chris said, our ancestors were 2% or below. So try to stay at 2% is that 2% of your calories?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
2% of your calories.
Yeah. below. So like,
Yeah.
let's say that your total linoleic acid gram consumption was like 3 grams. And so you do 3 times 9, and then you would divide that by your total calorie intake to get your percentage linoleic acid. And so we really do think that you should try to keep that percentage as low as possible. So if you're on the market for some eggs, we do ship our eggs, Angel Acres Farm. But I think that this just shows the chicken and pork consumption. There's been a rapid increase in chicken and pork consumption over the last decade, millennia, or last like 100 years. And a lot of mainstream has told us that that's healthier because red meat is bad, right? It clogs our arteries. That's BS. And so we've got a rise. We not only have a rise in vegetable oil, but now compounding on top of that, we have a rise in chicken and pork consumption where these chickens and pigs are fed vegetable oils. And so the percentage of their fatty acids are higher in omega-6. So we've got compounding effects that are leading to chronic disease development, impaired metabolisms, and obesity rates that we've never seen before. And so it's just unfortunate how much it's infiltrated our food system. But Chris, I know people talk about monogastric animals a lot.
Mm-hmm.
There's big issues with ruminants. So I came across some studies recently. So the belief is that ruminant animals, they go through this, they have 4 chamber stomachs. So they have a very complex digestive system. And through this process called biohydrogenation, they can convert PUFAs, so polyunsaturated fatty acids, into saturated fats. However, Chris, the research is so mind-boggling that you'll see the researchers will say, well, in order to reduce the amount of saturated fats in milk and meat products, we've designed new feed such that we've designed these new fat components of feed that can bypass the digestive process and directly enter the milk and meat products of these ruminants. And so we're literally creating very unancestral, non-natural feed for ruminants that it will impact the final fatty acid percentage. And this just isn't talked about much, but I'm going to be sharing more about it because, for example, here's one line from a study that I found. Linoleic acid concentration in milk normally ranges from 1.5 to 3% when cows are fed control normal diets. But feeding rumen protected fats increase the upper range of linoleic acid concentration to over 6.5%. And so we are creating these rumen protected fats. And so it's essentially just bypassing rumen digestion and just going straight into the final fat products of these ruminant animals. And so we are increasing the linoleic acid in ruminant milk, meat products as well. This is just insane. And it just shows how, like, this belief that PUFAs are healthy because they lower cholesterol, it's so deeply embedded into just research and nutrition space in general. It's having like profound impacts.
That is stunning. I had no idea about this, Ashley. It doesn't, although it's stunning, but it's not shocking.
Right.
Because we just constantly, we've seen, I mean, even going clear back to the 19th century, that just, I don't know what other word to call it. It's just insanity. The things that are done to our food systems and within our food systems. I remember many years ago that Sally Fallon of the Weston A. Price Foundation used the term commodity agriculture. And I didn't understand that at all. Actually, you probably would instantly understand it, but I had to think about it for probably years. I'm kind of slow, but I began to gradually comprehend that what she means by that is that that foods in our world are just commodities to most of the we'll call them food manufacturers, farmers,
Yep.
ranchers, but big food. But many farmers and ranchers don't really have that interest in our health like Ashley's organization. And there's literally hundreds, thousands of others that are doing great work like this. And I think we should just support all of them. You support them with your dollars. But again, big food hasn't the slightest concern for our health.
No.
Their interest is in you buy more. That's it.
Yeah.
They don't care that your health goes down the drain. There's only one other organization that potentially cares less for its customers, and that's big tobacco. But I really honestly think that even they don't. I don't even think they're not as bad as big food in a lot of ways.
I kind of got us off track there. So one, consume ancestral fats of butter, tallow, ghee. Two, try when you're going to consume chicken and pork, and honestly, even ruminant meat. Try to buy the highest quality that you can.
Right.
And then, what would be your third tip to reduce consumption of PUFAs?
Is reduce or eliminate nuts and seeds, at least for a while, just because they're high in omega-6. They're obviously tremendously better than seed oils, and you can't compare them side by side just because they're high omega-6. In my view, it makes no sense to do that. But for a while, I would suggest that you keep the nuts and seeds low. Macadamia nuts are really low in omega-6. They're like 2% omega-6. So I would say, once you've been on an ancestral diet for 3 years, as we talked about early on, and you get your omega-6 in your body fat, your cellular membranes down to an ancestral level, which means that they're under about 3% in your body, then you have a lot more leeway to use things like nuts and seeds. And I think that would be, in that scenario, you'd probably be a lot be fine using those. But they shouldn't be used. They should be used in minimally or in moderation, because those were never meant to be staples of the diet.
Especially raw. So if you're going to consume nuts and seeds, definitely sprout and soak and do all those Weston A. Price, Sally Fallon stuff.
Exactly.
And when you need your little bit of nuts, then go macadamia nuts are going to have significantly lower PUFAs, like you said.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Those are great tips. So to wrap up, Chris, where can people find you and how can people support your work? Because again, with your research studies and your foundation, you are just doing absolutely transformative work that I think is super important for the next generation of medicine and doctors and education. So how can people find you and support you?
So we have two foundations, Cure AMD Foundation and Ancestral Health Foundation. Cure AMD Foundation is at cureamd.org, and the Ancestral Health Foundation it's not available just yet, but at ancestralhealthfoundation.org. So that's coming. We have Facebook pages. We have Instagram, and I'm not up on the social media. I always forget this stuff. Suzanne Alexander takes care of all that. So let's see. We've got Facebook, Instagram. What's the other? Twitter.
I'll include links to all of those below in the description.
So people can find us through those. You can find me on YouTube and on podcasts and so forth. And people can reach out to me if they want to send me an email. They can go to cureamd.org and just go to the contact, and you can message me through there. So I'll be happy to try to answer any questions or whatever. But people can support us. They can support us. Our goal is ultimately to do this research. And I'll just say very quickly, Ashley, that what we want to do is my goal is to rather walk in the footsteps of Weston A. Price and do a 21st century version of his type of research, where we analyze populations that are still living ancestrally and consuming native traditional diets. There's a few of those around the world still, at least 5 or 6 populations like that. And then we would compare and contrast their genetic cohorts who are in the cities who have westernized their diets. And we look at everything about their diets and about their health and their fatty acids, like their omega-6 in their body fat, and compare those. And I think those studies, when we can accomplish that, that will begin to seriously change allopathic medicine. I think that's the only way to do it. I just don't believe there's another way to do it except through the published science and this kind of research.
That's incredible. So, guys, if you can go donate to his foundations to help fund this type of incredible research, because let's be honest, biopharma is not funding this. So
Right.
we got to make these things happen. And then also, Chris, you have a new book, an incredible book. So if you guys really want to dive into and better understand more than we went into today's topic, get his book. I have a copy. It's literally incredible. The
Okay.
Ancestral Diet Revolution. And he dives, like, if you need ammo to tell your friends why they shouldn't be consuming this, get that book, because it's going to give you all of the data that you need to better support your argument, to better explain to people why they should change the way that they're eating to improve their health, and how this wasn't done 100 plus years ago. So definitely check out his book. I think it's super easy to read while also providing you with plenty of data and science.
Right, and we would love for people to get the book, and also to leave us a review if you would on Amazon. That helps to spread this message. And again, and the proceeds of this book, they go to the foundation, so they don't come to me or anybody else. They just support our operations and will support eventual research.
So, okay, audience, that's a great way. Go buy the book. And then by buying the book, you're supporting the future studies that Chris will perform to help change the course of the literature that needs a huge change in direction. So, yeah. Any final words or any final thoughts from today's discussion?
Yeah, big picture is easy. Um, you can do this is relatively simple, the big picture, but when you have to navigate it through our food supply, it does get a little difficult. And so I would just say to everybody, hang in there, just stick with it, and just work at it. Best way to do this is make your own food. And again, your health you'll never know what condition, disease you'll prevent. And this could save your own life. It could save the lives of your family members and your friends. So just spread this message. That's all we're about here is spreading this
Great.
message.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed this discussion. We'll have to get you on again and dive into, I think I'd love to talk more about, like, specifically what these different ancestral populations have consumed, because I think that that's always fun to learn about. So we'd love to have you back on one
Oh,
day.
that'd be great, Ashley. I'd love to do that. That's one of
Yeah.
my favorite things is digging into those ancestral populations.
Yeah, that'd be fun. All right. Thanks so much,
Thank you
Chris.
so much.